CEO follows black employee working double shifts after seeing him hide food, and discovers a shocking truth that will rock his empire. Victor watched, frozen by the window of his top-floor office, as Marcus discreetly stashed a container of food in his battered backpack. Could this dedicated employee be stealing? The scene seemed innocent at first glance, just an employee taking home leftovers, but something about the man's furtive behavior set off alarm bells in his mind. The cafeteria chef looked nervously around before handing over the package, as if they were conducting a forbidden transaction. Why would one of my most dedicated employees act like he's stealing food? Victor muttered to himself, frowning. Marcus Jefferson had been working at Harmon Logistics for almost 4 years. He was one of those model employees who rarely missed work, always put in overtime, and constantly appeared in productivity reports. Victor had never spoken to him directly, but his name was familiar from the documents that crossed his desk. Unable to control a curiosity he didn't understand, Victor grabbed his coat and followed Marcus at a distance as he left the building. What secret is Marcus hiding that could change everything? The CEO had built his empire from scratch, turning a small local company into a national powerhouse in just 15 years. His motto was simple: hard work and discipline lead to success, words he not only preached but believed deeply. The night was cold, with a biting wind heralding the arrival of fall. To Victor's surprise, Marcus didn't head for the parking lot. Instead, he walked to the nearest bus stop, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight that went far beyond his old backpack. He works overtime almost every day, Victor thought. Why doesn't he have his own car? Why does he look so exhausted? When the bus arrived, Victor made an impulsive decision. He got on a few seconds after Marcus and sat several seats behind him. The vehicle moved away from the bright commercial district, diving into increasingly less lit areas of the city. After 20 minutes, they entered a neighborhood that Victor, despite having lived in the same city for decades, had never visited. Marcus got off in an area where half the street lights were broken. Houses in urgent need of repair, crooked fences, and cracked sidewalks made up the landscape. It was the kind of place people like Victor only saw in documentaries about urban inequality. Following him at a safe distance, Victor watched Marcus climb the outside stairs of a small, visibly run-down apartment complex. Through the thin curtains, Victor caught a glimpse of the interior when the door opened. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There was no real furniture, no sofa, no table, no bookshelf, just a mattress on the floor, stacked plastic boxes containing what looked like folded clothes, and a cheap lamp illuminating the virtually empty space. And then, emerging from the shadows, 2 small faces, children running to hug Marcus as soon as he entered. Victor stood motionless in the darkness, feeling his world begin to spin. Marcus wasn't getting food for himself, it was for his children. The next scene broke something inside him. Marcus knelt on the worn wooden floor, opened the container almost reverently, and divided the food between the 2 children. There was no portion for him. He just watched with a tired smile as the children ate with the urgency of those who don't know when their next meal will be. Victor recoiled into the shadows, his mind in conflict. How was this possible? Marcus worked full-time, often overtime, and was praised for his dedication. How could he barely feed his children? How could he live in such precarious conditions? The math simply didn't add up in Victor's privileged mind unless the salary that he, Victor Harmon, considered fair and competitive wasn't enough for a decent life. Not when you had children to support, a roof to keep over their heads, bills to pay, and Victor now suspected when there were perhaps other invisible barriers that Marcus faced on a daily basis. If this story is touching your heart and making you question the invisible inequalities around us, be sure to subscribe to Black Voices to follow the unfolding of this powerful narrative about privilege, responsibility, and the true meaning of social justice. The next morning, Victor arrived at the office before the sun was even fully up. His deep dark circles revealed a sleepless night haunted by the hungry faces of Marcus' children. Determined to understand how such a dedicated employee lived in such precarious conditions, he accessed the human resources system and pulled up the complete file. Marcus Jefferson, 34 years old, employee for almost 4 years, consistently exemplary evaluations, never late, rarely absent, salary within market average for the position. Victor frowned, doing the math in his head. The The salary seemed reasonable on the corporate spreadsheet, but when confronted with the reality of the cost of living, Diane, he called his assistant on the intercom. "Can you bring me an updated report on housing and food costs in the metropolitan area and also data on real wage increases over the last 5 years at Harmon Logistics versus inflation?" While he waited, Victor continued examining the file. Something caught his eye. Marcus had requested salary advances 3 times in the last year. All approved, but with a note from the finance department: "Consider limiting future advances, worrisome pattern." When the requested reports arrived, the truth became painfully clear. The cost of living had risen 68% in the last 5 years, while operating salaries at Harmon had increased only 12%. The math was relentless. A single father with 2 children would be constantly on the verge of financial collapse. "How did I let this happen?" Victor muttered, running his hands over his face. "How did I not see this coming?" A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Rachel Kim, the HR director, entered with a concerned expression. "Mr. Harmon, your assistant mentioned that you're reviewing compensation data. Can I help?" Victor hesitated briefly before deciding to trust her. "Rachel, I'll be blunt. Yesterday, I witnessed something that deeply disturbed me. One of our employees who works double shifts can barely feed his children. I'm trying to understand how that's possible when we pay competitive salaries." Rachel sat down, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Finally, someone is asking that question," she said quietly. "Mr. Harmon, I've tried to raise this issue at the last 3 budget meetings. I have detailed reports on employees facing food insecurity, evictions, inability to pay health insurance. Why haven't I ever seen these reports?" Victor interrupted, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. They were summarized before they reached the board. Lawrence and the finance committee considered the details irrelevant to the strategic vision. Lawrence Parker, the chairman of the board, the same man who had ridiculed Victor's idea of corporate social responsibility as expensive sentimentality at the last executive retreat. "Show me everything," Victor demanded. "Every report, every request, every individual case." Over the next few hours, Rachel revealed a reality that existed parallel to the glossy world of quarterly reports and growth celebrations. Employees sleeping in cars between shifts because they couldn't afford gas to get to and from work. Parents missing work because they couldn't afford childcare, then getting penalized. Families sharing tiny apartments to split costs. "How does this affect our black workforce specifically?" Victor asked, suspecting the answer. Rachel hesitated. "It's disproportionate. Black employees like Marcus face an additional burden of discrimination in the housing market. Many pay more for worse accommodations. Others face longer commutes because they have to live farther away. And then there are health issues and access to credit." The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. Victor knew he would face resistance. Lawrence and the others would defend the status quo tooth and nail. Responsibility to shareholders would be the shield they used to protect their own bonuses. "One last thing," Victor asked. "What was the percentage increase in executive bonuses last year?" 22%, Rachel replied without consulting her documents. The comparison was obscene. While executives received raises that exceeded inflation, frontline employees could barely keep up with skyrocketing basic costs. "We're going to need a plan," Victor said finally. "Something that can't be ignored or summarized in a harmless paragraph." Rachel smiled for the first time that morning. "Actually, I've been working on something, but I never thought I'd have a chance to implement it." She opened her laptop and showed Victor a detailed proposal: phased salary increases, housing subsidies, a childcare program, expanded health benefits, and an emergency fund for unforeseen needs. "That's extraordinary," Victor murmured, studying the numbers. "And financially feasible," Rachel added, "if we redirect some of the executive bonuses and the expansion budget." Lawrence would be furious. The shareholders would be apprehensive. But Victor felt a determination growing inside him, something he hadn't felt since the early days of building the company. "Get everything ready for this afternoon's meeting," he instructed. "We're going to hit them with data they can't ignore." When Rachel left, Victor looked out the panoramic window at the company parking lot. He saw Marcus arriving for his shift, his shoulders visibly tired. As he watched that man walk toward the building, Victor realized that he wasn't just witnessing the struggle of an individual. He was seeing the physical manifestation of a system designed to keep people like Marcus permanently on the margins, no matter how hard they tried. What the board couldn't imagine was that the Victor who would walk into the boardroom that afternoon would not be the same calculating, pragmatic man they were used to. They expected to discuss market expansion and growth strategies. But they were about to face something much more revolutionary, a CEO who had awakened to his own role in perpetuating inequality and was determined to correct it, even if it meant challenging the very system that had made him rich. The conference room at Harmon Logistics fell silent as Victor strode in carrying a thick briefcase under his arm. Lawrence Parker, the chairman of the board, looked up impatiently from his documents. "Victor, finally, we were about to start without you," he said with feigned cordiality. "As I mentioned, your issue regarding salaries will have to wait. We have investors waiting for our expansion plans." Victor placed the briefcase on the polished table and looked around. 12 faces stared back at him, executives and major shareholders, all impeccably dressed in their expensive suits, all comfortably ensconced in their bubbles of privilege. "There will be no postponement," he replied with surprising calm. "What I have to present today cannot wait another day." Before Lawrence could protest, Victor activated the projector. On the screen appeared an image that made the entire room freeze, the interior of Marcus' apartment with his children sharing a single meal on the floor of a virtually empty room. "This is the apartment of one of our most dedicated employees," Victor declared, "a man who has worked full-time, often overtime, for nearly 4 years. Lawrence adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "That's unfortunate, but surely an isolated case." "It's not isolated," interrupted Rachel Kim, the HR director Victor had called to the meeting. "We have concrete data showing that 38% of our operational employees live below the poverty line, even though they work full-time. That number rises to 62% when we look at Black and Latino employees alone." The room fell silent as Victor relentlessly presented case after case, number after number, chart after chart, the reality that most of these executives had chosen to ignore for years. "And while our employees can barely feed their children," she continued, projecting a new slide, "we approved a 22% increase in executive bonuses last year." Lawrence stood up, his face reddening. "Victor, we all regret these individual situations, but we're a company, not a charity. We have responsibilities to our shareholders and to the people who build our company," Victor retorted, his voice rising. "The people without whom none of us would be sitting in this room enjoying million-dollar bonuses." The next slide caused a visible shock, a comparative analysis of Harmon's salaries with the actual cost of living, showing the racial disparity in promotions and raises, even among employees with identical qualifications. "My proposal is simple," Victor declared. "An immediate 30% salary increase for all employees below the management level. Implementation of childcare benefits, transportation and housing subsidies, and an emergency fund for medical and family needs." "Completely unworkable," Lawrence protested. "The costs would be astronomical." "Not if we redirect the executive bonuses," Victor replied calmly. "Starting with mine." A murmur rippled through the room. Stephanie Chun, the chief financial officer, broke the silence. "If we adjust the expansion funds and bonuses, we could implement a 20% increase in some basic benefits, but 30%, Victor insisted. "And the child care program is non-negotiable." Diane Harper, an influential shareholder who rarely spoke at meetings, leaned forward. 25% implemented in 2 phases over 6 months with a guaranteed quarterly review. Full child care program and a study to subsidize housing in the next fiscal year." She looked directly at Victor. "That's the best we'll get today, and you know it." Lawrence laughed scornfully. "You're not serious, are you? One walk through a poor neighborhood and suddenly our CEO wants to dismantle our financial structure." "Put it to a vote," Victor ordered, ignoring him. "Or I have 2 alternatives." His voice took on a coldness that silenced even Lawrence. "First, I resign as CEO and sell my shares to a social justice-focused investment group that has already expressed interest." The faces around the table paled. Victor controlled 28% of the shares, enough to cause an earthquake in the administration. Second, I released this entire dossier on our labor practices to the press, including specific cases of racial disparity in compensation and promotion. Lawrence stood up in a rage. That's corporate blackmail. No, Victor corrected him. It's social responsibility. The vote was close, 6-6, with Victor's tie-breaking vote as chairman deciding in favor of the changes. Lawrence gathered his documents, his face contorted with rage. You just committed corporate suicide, Victor. The shareholders are going to destroy you. Victor remained unmoved. Or maybe we're finally building something worth preserving. The next morning, as the corporate world was still processing the earthquake at Harmon Logistics, Marcus Jefferson found an envelope in his locker. Inside was a letter announcing his promotion to a new position, Employee Wellness Coordinator, with a substantial pay raise, effective immediately. What Marcus couldn't have imagined was that this seemingly isolated act represented only the first wave of a much deeper transformation. As the news spread through the company's hallways, something began to change in the air, not just the hope for better wages, but the awakening of a long-denied dignity and the beginning of a conversation about privilege and responsibility that would transcend the walls of Harmon Logistics, questioning the very foundations upon which American business success was supposedly built. 6 months had passed since that fateful meeting. Harmon Logistics had been completely transformed. Marcus Jefferson walked through the company's new community center, watching children play on the newly built playground. Among them were his own children, now wearing new clothes and sporting carefree expressions he hadn't seen in years. As Employee Welfare Coordinator, his office was strategically located where everyone could easily find him, a radical change from his former invisible position in the logistics department. The child care program already serves 83 families, Marcus reported to the CEO as they walked side by side. Absenteeism has dropped 42% since parents no longer have to choose between working and caring for sick children. Victor nodded, looking around the space. In addition to the playground, the center offered preventive health care, free tutoring, and nutritious meals at a nominal cost. It was a solution that had emerged directly from suggestions Marcus had collected from employees. How's your family doing? Victor asked with genuine interest. We moved into a bigger apartment closer to the kids' school, Marcus replied with a smile. My oldest daughter is sleeping in her own bed for the first time in her life. What Victor never revealed to Marcus was the truth about that night, how he had followed him home and witnessed his reality. That secret would remain with him, transformed into fuel for permanent change. At corporate headquarters, the transformation was equally visible. Quarterly reports now included not only financial metrics, but also indicators of employee well-being. Retention rates had jumped to record highs. Productivity had increased even with more flexible work schedules. And, surprising to skeptics like Lawrence, profits continued to grow. Investors were skeptical at first, Diane Harper commented during a shareholder meeting. But the numbers don't lie. Harmon has become more profitable, not less, since implementing the equity policies. Lawrence Parker, who had initially threatened to sue Victor and have him fired, now rarely showed up at meetings. His power had diminished dramatically as other shareholders saw the positive results and aligned themselves with a new vision. In fact, Harmon Logistics had become a case study in business schools, an example of how progressive labor policies could coexist with financial success. Business journalists now knocked on Victor's door for interviews about conscious capitalism and racial equity in the corporate environment. One Friday afternoon, Victor found a report on his desk that made him smile. The data showed that the racial wage gap of the company, once glaring, had narrowed significantly in recent months. There was still work to be done, but the change was undeniable. Looking out his office window, Victor saw Marcus in the parking lot helping an elderly employee with some bags. The same man who had once struggled to support his own children was now lifting others up around him. You were right, said Rachel Kim, entering the room with more reports. When people don't have to worry about basic needs, they flourish. I was wrong for a long time, Victor corrected. I built an empire on the idea that hard work always pays off, but I never considered that the playing field isn't level for everyone. That evening, during the official opening of the community center, Victor stepped up to the makeshift stage for a few words. He looked out at the diverse crowd of employees and their families, faces he had barely known before, stories he had never considered. For years, he began, I believed that our success was solely the result of determination and merit. It took me too long to realize that privilege isn't just what you have, but also the obstacles you never had to face. The audience fell silent, absorbing those unusual words from a CEO. True leadership isn't about accumulating power or wealth, Victor continued. It's about using your position to level the playing field for everyone. Shared success is the only sustainable success. As applause echoed, Victor watched Marcus hug his children. None of them would ever know that this moment of transformation had begun with a simple act of theft, food hidden in a backpack, and a CEO who was too curious for his own good. The true legacy of Harmon Logistics would not be measured in financial records or global expansion, but in the transformed lives of families like Marcus. Victor understood finally that his greatest achievement was not building an empire, but having the courage to question it and reform it when he realized its fundamental flaws. In the future, when people asked about the decisive moment that transformed Harmon Logistics from just another faceless corporation into a model of ethical and equitable business, few would trace it back to that cold night when a privileged CEO first witnessed the brutal reality that his own system had helped create. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is that real change rarely begins with grand manifestos or revolutionary plans. Often, it begins when someone in a position of power finally sees the humanity of those whom the system has made invisible and chooses to act. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to Black Voices for more narratives that make us reflect on the world and how we can make it a fairer place. After all, the greatest social transformations begin when we open our eyes to realities beyond our bubbles of privilege and decide we can no longer pretend we didn't see.